My name is Josh Bales. I'm Program Manager at the National Center for Victims of Crime, and welcome to Taking Action, Assisting Victims of Financial Fraud, a joint webinar of the National Center for Victims of Crime and the FINRA Investor Education Foundation. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. We're going to spend some time today talking about victims of financial fraud and how we can better assist those victims, with a particular focus and emphasis on a recent tool, a guide produced jointly by the National Center for Victims of Crime and the FINRA Investor Education Foundation called Taking Action, Assisting Victims of an Advocate's Guide to Assisting Victims of Financial Fraud, which we'll be talking more about. Again, I am the guy that looks a lot like George Clooney on the left there, Joshua Bales. I'm a program manager and soon-to-be staff attorney here at the National Center for Victims of Crime and the National Crime Victim Bar Association. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Christine Kiefer, who's the Senior Director at the FINRA Investor Education Foundation and has been a driving force behind a lot of work to improve outcomes and responses and also help prevent financial fraud, particularly in the investment fraud area, but has done great work on behalf of victims in financial fraud areas. So Christine, welcome, and she's going to tell you a little bit about her organization.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you to the National Center for organizing this webinar. Just in case anyone's not familiar, we'll start with an introduction to who FINRA is and the FINRA Foundation. FINRA is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and we are an independent, non-governmental regulator. We regulate all stockbrokers and brokerage firms in the country. We are not part of the government, as it says here, but we do report up to the Securities and Exchange Commission and work closely with the Securities and Exchange Commission and state securities regulators to regulate markets and the sale of securities products. We have regulatory oversight, of course. We do enforcement and outreach and education, and that's why we're here today. Through the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, we award grants primarily to libraries and United Way and community-based organizations, but more wholesomely, we offer targeted projects like the one that we're discussing today around fraud prevention and financial fraud. We also have a robust program working with the military on military financial readiness issues.
Thanks, Christine. And of course, I'm with the National Center for Victims of Crime. Many of you may be familiar with our organization. Our mission is to forge a national commitment to help victims of crime rebuild their lives. We do this in a variety of ways, including advocacy, education and training, and serving as a trusted resource of technical assistance for victim advocates. You may be familiar with some of our resource centers, such as the DNA Resource Center, which provides important cutting-edge information on the use of DNA in criminal prosecution and as an advocacy tool for victims of crime. We have a Stalking Resource Center, which provides premier information on stalking. We have a National Crime Victim Bar Association, which has over 300 member attorneys who pursue civil lawsuits on behalf of victims of crime, and a referral line that I'll talk more about later that can be used by victim advocates to give to victims as a place they can call to seek civil justice. We also do a variety of public policy work, both at the state and federal level, to advance the law on behalf of victims of crime. So that's a little bit about the National Center. In 2012, at the National Center's annual conference, we had a speaker talk about financial fraud, and particularly as it related to older Americans. And it was at that conference that the nexus for a partnership sort of was born. And from that, Mike Fernandez, our executive director, and Christine Kiefer began to talk about partnering together as an organization to do something on behalf of victims of financial fraud. And so we came together to create a resource that would help victim advocates provide the very best level of service to victims in financial fraud, and to try to help move the ball down the road a little bit so that advocates were able to help victims access the systems they needed to recover. So our project came together, and we really focused on improving the outcome for financial fraud victims, not merely prevention, but we wanted to focus on what happens once you've been victimized, and so we've obviously emphasized recovery. We've worked really hard to make sure that we're victim-affirming and victim-centered in all of our approaches, and we wanted to develop a resource that was really easy to use and accessible. And we think we've accomplished all three of these things, and we think that those three things are going to make a big difference for victims in the coming years.
So why financial fraud? Most of you on the call today and on the webinar today are probably somehow already steeped into this subject, and thus your interest in this. But just to give you a little perspective and a couple of numbers to take home, financial fraud is incredibly prevalent. And while it doesn't hit every household, it targets every household. In a recent study that the FINRA Investor Education Foundation we unveiled in September, we found that more than 8 in 10, these were adults 40 plus, it was around a little over 2,400 individuals that we surveyed, had been solicited for potentially fraudulent offers in the last year. The Stanford University Financial Fraud Research Center, basing their work on a variety of research studies, came up with a figure estimating about $50 billion per year is lost to financial fraud. And that's hitting, according to the Federal Trade Commission, something like 30 million people in the United States. Now, we don't have a perfectly accurate number for the lost money to fraud, and we'll talk a little bit about why, but part of it is underreporting, and that can be a really big issue, and that's a role that you can help facilitate and play a role in improving. Another reason that the National Center and the FINRA Foundation are very focused on financial fraud and why we think it's important that we all join together on this is that Americans aged 65 and older are more likely to be targeted. Now, we intuitively know this, and many people probably say this, but we did find it to be true in the studies that have been done. But what's more alarming is that we found that older Americans were more likely to actually engage in the offers. We compared the 65-plus population in our study to those aged 40 to 49, and we found that the older population was 34% more likely to have lost money once solicited in these potentially fraudulent offers. And so that just gives you a little bit of context around the scope of the problem and where we're going. Another alarming statistic is really that many Americans cannot identify classic red flags of fraud, and that's an area where the FINRA Foundation has focused a great deal of time and effort with a lot of input and direction from AARP and others that are leading in this space, and looking at the psychology of fraud. We're not going to talk in a lot of detail on the psychology of fraud today, but it is important to recognize that it's all about emotion. And fraud in itself distorts reality. And in our study, we threw out some different pitches to see how audiences reacted. And we found that 42% of our respondents actually found 110% a year appealing. Some people did identify that as a red flag, but many people identified that as something that they would like to hear more about. So just a little example. Now, who is Ruth? A couple of years ago, I was sitting at my desk on any typical day like you are right now, kind of busy, probably multitasking, not particularly interested in answering the phone. Especially a number came up, I didn't recognize it, but I remembered my job was, at that time, was to take investor calls, and I thought, well, maybe this is something important. I'm not going to let this go to voicemail. I'll answer it. And on the other line was Ruth Mitchell, who you see here. Now, Ruth had called the FINRA Foundation because she heard we were doing work around fraud and financial fraud prevention, and she wanted to offer her story. She had already reported her crime, or the crime that had happened to her and her husband, Len. They had already had some resolution. The fellow had just gone to jail. She had testified before the Senate Committee on Aging. She was out there sharing her voice. But she didn't feel that she was being heard. And so Ruth came to the FINRA Investor Education Foundation so that we could amplify her voice and her fraud fighter knowledge and tools. As it turns out, Ruth and Len, just a little side story on them, Ruth and Len had lived just outside of Pittsburgh at the time of the victimization, and for 11 years they invested, quote unquote, invested money with a fellow who had started out as their small business accountant for Len's architecture firm. Len was a strong business professional. Ruth was a professional ice skating instructor, and they were doing well. Len had learned about an opportunity from their accountant, proceeded to invest $10,000 with a fellow named Barry Corkin, and over the course of 11 years invested $130,000. Now you see the picture here of Ruth, and you probably thought she was my primary victim. But as it turns out, Len and Ruth together, but first Len, had become interested in the offer and had been solicited by Barry Corkin. So I try to remember Ruth whenever I'm going through our stories. We've since worked with her. As I said, Barry went to jail, and Ruth and Len lost the $130,000. They never received any of the money. I think they did receive a settlement, but they have yet to receive a single dollar on that money. And when Josh and I were out in Phoenix a couple of months ago at the National Center's conference, I had an opportunity to visit with Ruth because they live in Phoenix, outside of Phoenix now. And I learned that she and Len were both ailing, they're both aging, and now is that time that they need that $130,000. They're struggling to find a retirement community that they can move into that can accommodate their growing health problems with the money that they have left. That $130,000 could have made a big difference to the lives of Ruth and Len.
So as victim advocates, each of you encounters victims on maybe a daily basis, but fairly regularly. Perhaps it's a senior adult who's lost their money in a fake lottery scheme, either via the mail or telephone. Maybe it's an identity theft victim whose credit has been ruined by an identity thief who's perhaps filed taxes in their name in a way that's made it almost impossible for them financially as a victim to move forward. Perhaps it's a person like Ruth who's been a victim of investment fraud, or maybe it's a domestic violence victim whose finances were a target of the batterer's power and control, and that domestic violence victim is looking for a way to recover not only from physical or sexual violence that she's experienced in that intimate partner relationship, but really financial violence and financial control. All of these people are victims that we had in mind when we began putting together the Advocate's Guide to Assisting Victims of Financial Fraud. One of the things that we focused on really four things. We wanted it to be holistic in approach. That is, to treat recovery from financial fraud as not something just about getting money back or recovering money, but about emotional recovery, about mental health recovery. We wanted to make sure we set realistic expectations. As many of you are aware, financial recovery is often extremely difficult for victims of financial fraud because the nature of a criminal who takes money in a financial fraud scheme isn't that they keep it in an interest-bearing account with the name of the victim on it. That's not how it works. They spend the money, they use it to defraud others. So we wanted to set realistic expectations. We wanted to have clear action steps that were followable by victims, and we wanted to have a victim-centered approach that used language and that encouraged victim advocates to use the wide amount of training advocates have to treat victims with the respect and dignity that they deserve. And so that's how we began. Those were our goals when we began the guide, and we think we've achieved them. And so one of the first things we did right out of the gate is we took a look at what were some of the traditional costs of financial fraud, and many of these are ones that are obvious. It's loss of retirement savings, benefits, losses that include losses in your home equity, retirement income. You see the ability to live independently. This is a really big one for folks who are senior adults and are working, that want to stay independent as long as possible. It includes issues, especially in identity theft with employment. But one of the things that we noticed and really stuck out to us as we talked to victims was just the sheer amount of time and money that it costs to clear up financial fraud and credit records. It takes a lot of time to do that. So we wanted to focus especially on making it a little bit easier for folks to do that. We also recognized in talking with victims and victim advocates that there are a lot of non-financial costs. You see listed here multiple things that we're all aware that people experience in all types of crimes, both violent and nonviolent crime. And all of these are really parts of trauma. And what we recognized is that trauma is a part of financial fraud. It's a crime that causes financial fraud and is experienced by a victim not dissimilarly to some violent crime. And we also wanted to make sure we were clear that financial fraud is a legitimate crime. Now, to many advocates listening right now, that's not a shocking thing to say, but to a large portion of the public and many victims don't consider financial fraud a crime in a way that perhaps they should. And so what we wanted to do is make sure we emphasize that financial fraud is a crime that causes trauma and has a wide variety of responses, including things like shame, isolation, and anger. We wanted to be attentive to the whole person, to recognize that financial, as I said in the past, financial recovery is a part of the process, but it's not the only part of recovery. So after taking a look at those costs and collecting information and speaking with experts from around the country, we put together Taking Action, an advocate's guide to assisting victims of financial fraud. It has 4 major components. They are laying the foundation, the advocate's role, action steps, and additional resources. We're going to spend the next few minutes talking through each section, talking a little bit about why we built it the way we did, what's in the section, and we're going to encourage you to download the guide as you can from either of the 2 websites, either FINRA or the National Center's website. You can also order free copies from there as well. But that's what we're going to be talking about as we're going forward. And basically, in the brief overview, Laying the Foundation provides educational and informational resources for victim advocates. The advocate's role is really about what approach we think is a best practice for advocates to take. Obviously, action steps is self-explanatory, and we include some additional resources. So to talk a little bit now, we're going to talk a little bit now about laying the foundation and about that section, and specifically about what categories of financial fraud that we came up with.
Hi, thank you. So the categories that we have added to the guide now, I will admit, and Josh could attest, started out even broader than the 4 that you see here. But we wanted to make this a very approachable and achievable guide. And so we've sort of brought together the key areas of financial fraud in categories that made sense for how we respond to problems in this area. So the key categories that we've chosen to identify are identity theft, investment fraud, which is an area where the FINRA Foundation has the most focus and expertise directly, mortgage and lending fraud, which certainly in recent years has been a growing concern, and mass marketing and other. This is not to say, this is inclusive of sweepstakes, lottery, all sorts of other mass-targeted financial frauds that may even be more prevalent than some of these others we see up here in the categories. And part of what the victim advocate can do is help the victims work through sort of which categories they fit into so that you can best help them with the resources. But ultimately, fraud happens through the use of persuasion and influence, no matter what category it falls into. Now, identity theft, you might say, could be, or is in some cases, strictly a matter of theft. And in some cases, identity theft does evolve a deceptive situation as well. But for the most part, the other frauds that we're talking about involve very conscious deception of the perpetrator and to the victim. The FINRA Foundation, working with AARP and a number of different social scientists, sort of isolated the 5 most prevalent tactics that are used to perpetrate, in this case, investment fraud, but it also applies heavily to the lottery and sweepstakes types of frauds. And we focus on these 5 key tactics in a lot of our prevention messaging. Now, I know we're talking about post-prevention, sort of after when prevention fails in this case. But this can help you perhaps understand some of the victim experience and what victims have been going through in the process before they ever came to you. So in most cases, particularly in investment fraud, there's some sort of dangling of a phantom rich. There's building of a dream. And so the victim is brought in to the belief that they can have something that wouldn't normally be available to them. The perpetrator has probably put themselves out there as an expert, as a very credible person. Perhaps they've built up their trust in the community. Maybe they're a big philanthropist in the community. On a side note, probably with other people's money. But as an aside, they use this credibility in the community and with that person to leverage trust. And trust is where they end up failing the victims. Social consensus is another tactic that's heavily used, and this is really the key behind affinity fraud, where people use the trust that's inherent in groups of like people, whether it's at shared ethnicity or shared religion or shared civic membership or country club membership. The social consensus is another trust lever, and it just gets us to step beyond and think that if other people are doing it like me, there might be more pressure for me to want to do it to be part of the group, but also it gives me a false sense that someone else probably did some homework and that there's probably someone, Joe Smith down the street or whoever, well, he's a pretty sophisticated guy and he's in on it, I bet this thing is legit. So it's a false sense of hope or trust once again. Reciprocity, we're all familiar with the free things that we get in the mail, the free things that we get at the mall and everywhere else, particularly at trade shows where people are offered free items just for attending, just for coming by. But in all cases, reciprocity is used as a lever to try to convince us subconsciously that we need to give back. So in the case of investment fraud, a person is maybe asked not to bring their checkbook to that free lunch seminar, but they're certainly going to answer the phone when the presenter calls them up a week later and wants to talk a little bit more about their personal situation. So reciprocity, yet another lever in how the fraud happens. And finally, scarcity. Don't need to describe this much, as we all have a sense of scarcity in our lives. There's scarcity of time, scarcity of product, and another level of scarcity that we don't represent here but that we find very important is exclusivity. So there's scarcity in the sense that people are exclusively invited into something. They feel extra special. It makes them feel particularly important, and yet another lever in how fraud happens. So just as a summary, these are the emotional experiences that the victims are going through. Perpetrators are really levering on 3 key emotions in their victims. They're leveraging on compassion, messages that appeal to the heart. And I need not say, but I will say, all of these tactics and all of these emotions are used by marketers, probably by many of us in our outreach and in our work. But it's only when they're being used deceptively to gain trust, ultimately to steal, where it's a problem. So just like anyone, you're looking for compassion, looking at fear, messages that scare us into action. Fear generally shows up sort of at the bottom third of a transcript if you looked at a transcript of a call with a perpetrator and a victim, in the sense that it's that final fear and that final push of scarcity that pushes us over the edge and forces us to take action. Because most people, particularly in the case of finances, face something called inertia, which is bodies in motion stay in motion, bodies at rest tend to stay at rest. And so if you want someone to actually take action, you need to spur them in some way. And the fraudsters know this. And certainly affinity and social acceptance is another area that is that I already mentioned with social consensus, but it's levering on these 3 key emotions and using the tactics that we talked about. This is what sends the victim into a tailspin, because once they realize that they've been victimized, all of these, they begin to question all the experiences they've been through, and this can set into motion a very traumatic experience that's well beyond the financial loss.
Hello, folks. I understand some of you are having a little trouble hearing me, so I'll try to speak a little bit louder, and you can definitely feel free to continue to contact Sam if you're having trouble hearing me. We're efforting making it a little bit more accessible for you, and apologize for the inconvenience. One of the things as we were developing, laying the foundation, that we discovered was that a lot of folks, there are a lot of barriers to recovery, and the barriers were really influential for us as we sort of began to put them in categories and understand them, because we wanted to know, what do we need to help advocates do to help victims overcome these barriers? And a lot of these barriers you know, are barriers that you're probably aware of. You know, there's a sense among a lot of financial fraud victims that they don't know where to turn. And as an identity theft victim said to me pretty recently, it doesn't really matter where I report it, no one's going to help me. And so there's a lot of mistrust of those who are supposed to be helping out victims, and a lot of misunderstanding about what reporting can do and can't do. There's a fear of loss of financial control. This is particularly true for a lot of senior adults who are potentially talking about losing control of their finances because they are no longer have capacity. There's a lot of fear of reporting it because perhaps someone will become involved and take that away from them. And so there's also folks who are threatened. You know, financial fraud takes place in intimate relationships just like it does in stranger relationships. So there's threatening. There's the potential for embarrassment. And so folks don't often report or attempt to recover because they don't want anyone to know that they've been victimized. There's oftentimes, as several prosecutors have pointed out to me, a lot of concern about the family or friend who's victimized them from being arrested. People are concerned that the person who committed this crime maybe is their son or daughter, and they don't want them to go to jail. And so they're not sure how to recover. And then, of course, all of this is sort of wrapped up in the lack of confidence in the authorities to respond and assist. And so each of these barriers informed our development of the advocate's role section. And this section really focused first and foremost on showing compassion and active listening. Most victim advocates have received extensive training in this area. We just wanted to remind folks that that's something you need to do on a regular basis with victims of financial fraud. We wanted to make sure that advocates knew that identifying the type of fraud is often helpful for individuals who are victims of financial fraud. Sometimes victims don't quite have a name when they show up at your door. Many of you will get victims who already know what's happened to them, but when you don't, identifying it's really helpful. Additionally, we wanted to make sure advocates were really encouraging reporting. And the reason that we wanted to encourage that is statistics have shown us that reporting is not happening at a rate that it needs to, and the way government resources and nonprofit resources are allocated, the more reporting and the more recognition of this as a crime and a serious problem, the more resources are dedicated towards combating financial fraud. So we want to encourage people to connect to multiple resources for reporting. Again, as we talked about, we wanted to set expectations. I'll discuss that a little more in a moment. And we want to make sure advocates understand why victims may return multiple times to report and talk about the same crime. And that's sometimes because of the effects of trauma, as with many other crimes, but also because financial fraud is often reperpetrated multiple times by the same perpetrator on the same victim. And maybe the first time they come into your office or talk to you on the phone, they've uncovered one portion of the financial fraud, but more may be discovered down the line. And lastly, we wanted to make sure that prevention resources were shared, that folks knew where to get prevention resources and how to help victims prevent themselves from being re-victimized, because victims are often re-victimized at a higher rate than first-time victims. And we also wanted to make sure that the victim advocacy community in each locale was networking, because what we heard from folks who do this on the ground across the country is that local networking can make a huge difference in improving outcomes for victims. So that really gives you an overview of the advocate's role. And what we really wanted to make sure we covered is what victims needed to know. So we wanted advocates to share with victims some things that we felt like victims needed to know about recovering from financial fraud. And the first one is that recovery requires work. That is, the victim's going to have to do quite a bit to recover from this crime. And that's important to set that expectation that there's a lot of reporting that has to be done, there's a lot of information that has to be covered, and there are a lot of agencies that each have to be responded to. And that's going to require a lot of work. We also wanted to make sure victims knew that reporting really does matter. While it may not always lead to recovery for that individual victim, for the larger group of victims around the country, reporting really assists in allocating resources. Also, many times in financial fraud, especially mass marketing and investment fraud, it is a group that's victimizing multiple individuals around the country. And reporting helps law enforcement and the prosecutor's office better identify this crime and help understand the scope of an individual crime. For instance, you think of famous Ponzi schemes that folks know of where there's multiple victims around the country, but the same is true, say, for fake lottery schemes or, what is colloquially known as Nigerian letter schemes where folks are encouraged to give money to help someone who's in trouble overseas. These kind of schemes, when they're reported, law enforcement are able to identify and track them. And also reporting matters because the more agencies you report to, the better chance you have of finding someone who can assist you as an individual victim. We wanted to make sure victims knew that full recovery is really difficult to achieve. And by full recovery, here I mean financial recovery. Oftentimes, that's just not possible, and restitution often doesn't make up for the damage caused. Sometimes recovery is not possible at all. And we wanted to make sure advocates understood that and could share that with victims. Because that's a difficult thing to say, but when said in a compassionate way and said in a way that provides expectations for individuals, it actually helps emotional and mental health recovery along the way. We wanted folks to know that pursuing things criminally is not the only route, that civil legal action is possible, but it may not work. It's not a cure-all for the problem. The National Crime Victim Bar Association, which we'll talk more about in the steps, is an organization that's affiliated with the National Center for Victims of Crime, connects victims with attorneys who will pursue cases on behalf of fraud victims. These attorneys work on a contingency fee basis, so there has to be some way to recover some fee out of the civil action. But with that in mind, victims should at least explore it, should at least consider it, because that may be a way that they can recover outside of the criminal justice system. We want victims to know that resources are available to victims in many states. Victims of financial fraud have access to victim compensation and victim assistance funds, though not all states. You should check your local jurisdiction. We wanted to know that there are resources available not only for reporting but for prevention and recovery throughout the country. We wanted to make sure that victims knew that recovery is also about your health. Financial fraud takes a really heavy toll on people's physical health, on their mental and emotional health. And so the recovery is not just about getting money back, but that victims need to know that they need to be attentive to themselves and take care of themselves. And lastly, and perhaps the one that's often most difficult, is that there may be silence. And what we mean by that is oftentimes when a victim reports financial fraud to law enforcement or to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, or to some other body, they're expecting some kind of response. There's going to be an investigation started, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. But that often many regulators are not tasked with investigating, but merely with collecting the reports, or only investigating it on a system-wide or nationwide level, or rather than on an individual basis. So we wanted folks to understand that not every regulator is going to respond individually to each case, because what I understand in my own personal life is that stress is most often created when reality does not meet expectations. So we wanted to set expectations in a place that was not a low bar so that we always cleared it, but not a high bar so that we always missed it. We wanted it to be in the middle, in a spot where expectations and reality lined up, so that victims were given an honest assessment of what was going to happen going forward. So with that in mind, after creating the advocate's role, we put together action steps for victims in the 4 categories already discussed. Each category has its own set of steps, but there are some common themes and some overlap that I want to talk about here with you all. Every victim that you see needs to start by creating a case file. The victim should maintain a central file that contains all the relevant documentation concerning the fraud perpetrated against him. That can be copies of their credit report, copies of solicitation letters they received, anything that they have, copy of call logs, anything you can think of that would help them demonstrate to an authority figure that they've been the victim of fraud. They should start keeping in a case file, including communication they have with law enforcement or other authorities they communicate with. The better file they have, the more organized file they have, the easier it'll be for them to demonstrate their case to a law enforcement authority, and also to help them track sometimes what's often very complex financial fraud. Secondly, every victim of every crime needs to know their rights. Victims of fraud have rights imparted by federal and in some cases state law, and victims need to know those rights to protect themselves. A state attorney general's office and the office of the local prosecutor will likely have staff that can explain that for the locality and for the state. The Office of Victims of Crime and the Department of Justice have information for victims of crime federally, but federal crime victim rights and state crime victim rights are important because victims of financial fraud have rights related to what the crime that's been committed against them and need to know it, and that way they can protect themselves and advocate for themselves. We wanted victims also, as step 3, to report the fraud really widely. And what we mean here by this is a lot of times I've encountered victims when I've talked to them on the phone who've called to find a civil attorney who I'll say, have you reported the crime, this financial fraud? And they'll say, well, I mean, I feel like the local police can't handle this kind of thing. And that's just not a true statement. Local police are often very interested in fraud and should be interested in fraud because it's a crime that's been perpetrated within their jurisdiction against a victim who lives there. Now, perhaps in a longer form jurisdictional analysis by law enforcement, they won't be able to pursue the investigation. But as a layperson who's not a law enforcement officer, that's not for me to decide. So we want to encourage victims to report it to as many people as they possibly can. This includes law enforcement, in many cases the local FBI field office, their state attorney general, who will often have a consumer protection division. Also, as some of my friends who are prosecutors would want me to say, always make sure that you're talking to the local district attorney or state's attorney about the crime, because a lot of times there can be a disconnect between law enforcement and the prosecutor's office, and having both informed can be really helpful. Making sure they're reporting it to the appropriate federal agency. Say if the crime was perpetrated through the mail, you have, and many of you on this call today are with the Postal Inspector Service, and you can report it there. So knowing the right place to report it and reporting it widely is very important. And last, we want every victim to consider civil remedies. The National Center for Victims of Crime has been working on civil remedies for victims and working on improving access to that for years. We believe it's a great way to get justice because we have the dual justice system in the U.S., the criminal and civil justice systems. And so the National Crime Victim Bar Association can provide referrals to attorneys. Within the guide is the telephone number for the National Crime Victim Bar Association. And when you refer a victim, they'll either speak to me or one of my fellow employees, and we'll be able to provide referrals to folks, to attorneys who can at least help them consider for free, because the initial consultation is free, to consider whether there's a case there or not and how they could pursue it and go forward. And that's a very big help for victims, we think, and something that we want victims to do because we want them to access every possible outlet for justice that they can. Next, we also included some steps for folks like you who are advocates, because we recognize that for recovery to happen, it takes two parties to do the recovery. It takes the victim to do their work, but also is going to require some work on behalf of the victim advocate to help make sure that recovery happens. So first and foremost, our step one was to refer victims to resources. This seems pretty self-explanatory, but one of the things that we notice in talking to some advocates is that it's not always clear what resources folks should be referred to, so we've included a resources section that we hope will help advocates refer victims to resources and help to connect them with resources, because if you're able to identify the fraud, you'll be able to connect them with resources that can be really beneficial. The second step we want every advocate to do is to make sure you're doing safety planning for your victims of financial fraud. Now, on the one hand, what I mean by safety planning is literally financial safety planning. So you're asking them, things like, have you registered your phone number on the do not call registry since you were a victim of mass marketing fraud over the telephone? In the case of someone who's getting a massive amount of mail, I know my grandmother would get mail from all kinds of sweepstakes around the country. I mean, just piles and piles of mail. And my mother would have to go over there and pull all of that out so that she didn't use that mail to basically give away money to individuals for no return. And so figuring out what the safety plan is going to be for someone is really important on the financial end to prevent further damage. But also we want folks to recognize that with financial fraud, there is sometimes, and in many cases, co-occurring domestic violence, co-occurring stalking, co-occurring elder abuse, all kinds of co-occurring intimate partner violence that's going on. And so safety planning has to be done in a physical sense as well. Victim advocates should use their training in safety planning to assist victims with co-occurring safety concerns. There's all kinds of training out there for that. The Office for Victims of Crimes Technical Training and Technical Assistance Center has training on safety planning. We want to encourage victim advocates to make sure that they're seeing other co-occurring crimes as they relate to financial fraud, because that kind of thing consistently happens. We've heard from victim advocates that it's missed sometimes when someone comes in and says, well, I've been a victim of someone stole my money, and people miss that there is some type of elder abuse or domestic violence going on. So we want to encourage folks to recognize that, spot it, and do the planning to help prevent further unsafe conditions. A couple of other steps we wanted folks to follow include step 3, which is consider calling adult protective services if necessary. A victim advocate should, anytime there's an adult with any type of potential capacity issue, whether that's you've assessed that they have some type of developmental disability, or perhaps they have dementia, or they're physically unable to take care of themselves due to age, whatever it is, victim advocates must ask themselves, do I need to involve adult protective services? Because to not do so would potentially be to fix one small portion of the victimization they're experiencing, but leave that adult open to further victimization. So folks should be assessing whether adult protective services needs to be involved, and adult protective services often has great resources on financial fraud, particularly as it relates to elder abuse, and can be very helpful in helping an adult recover and return to a place where they're safe and cared for. This is especially important if the perpetrator of the crime is a family member or a caregiver. If someone comes into you and says, my son has stolen this money from me, and they are a senior adult, making that assessment is vital. Many times it won't be necessary because it's not a capacity issue situation, but it's something that really needs to be done for every victim where there's any kind of potential capacity issue. And finally, one of the steps that we think is really important is referring folks to mental health counselors. Victim advocates should refer victims to local mental health counseling as appropriate. I know that many times in the localities, money that's available for victims of crime to go to mental health counselors is not available to victims of financial fraud. That is an unfortunate circumstance. So networking and finding places that might be able to assist either on a pro bono or low bono level is really important for victim advocates to do on a local level. If you're handling folks on a national level, one of the things I do with victims who are on the phone with me is to say, it's what you've experienced sounds really stressful, and it sounds like it's been a real burden for you. Do you have anyone to talk to about this? Are you able to see anyone about this? Just to put the idea out there, it's important for victims to know that it's normal to have experienced emotional trauma from financial fraud. It's normal to feel depressed, angry, guilty, shame, but that it's also normal to seek help for those feelings and to seek help so that recovery becomes a more holistic approach. So those are some of the things that we wanted to encourage victim advocates to do going forward. And then our last section provides resources, and Christine's going to talk to us a little bit about some resources that are available to you.
Thank you, Josh. And, you know, as Josh emphasized, this is really the tip of the iceberg. This is the beginning of a partnership for us and something that many of you are working on all of the time, and we hope that the guide that we put together, which obviously is much more in depth than the handful of slides we were able to share with you today, can help you navigate and triage the situation for victims that you may come in contact with. And ultimately, we might hope that more victims come forward and find organizations such as yourselves that can help them through this process. One place that the FINRA Investor Education Foundation is making available resources, and a place that you can access the Taking Action Guide in full, is saveandinvest.org. That's a website that the FINRA Foundation operates and put together. So if you look in this image in the upper left-hand side in a very fuzzy orange, it says Fraud Center. So I'm showing you actually what the front of the Fraud Center looks like, but when you go to Save and Invest generally, there's a carousel of options. One of the very front carousel items right now is the Taking Action Guide that we're talking about today. From that link, you can open the PDF immediately. But if you would like to order hard copies or print copies to distribute to others, go into the Fraud Center. And inside the Fraud Center, there's on the left-hand navigation, it says Program and Outreach Toolkit. And inside that toolkit, we make available for community organizations, law enforcement, and others more tools than we put forward right at the front of the website, because this website services investors directly as well as fraud fighters such as yourself. So in the Program and Outreach Toolkit, we make available a number of tools and resources. Taking Action is one of them. There's a materials ordering portal where you can place orders for multiple copies of Fighting Fraud brochure, which is shown here as an example, as well as a documentary film that the FINRA Foundation worked with AARP and American Public Television on called Tricks of the Trade, Outsmarting Investment Fraud. You also see it here. But you can order these, investor alerts, the Taking Action Guide, any or none of the above, in the materials ordering portal in that Program and Outreach Toolkit. We've currently set the limit on the Taking Actions to 150 per order. If you have a large number of advocates that you work with and you'd like a larger order than that, there's an email link. Just email us and talk to us about what you're doing. We're happy to fulfill larger orders as well. But I want to point out that the Taking Action Guide we're discussing today is for you. It's for the advocate. It's not directly for the victim. We will be developing some additional resources, some checklists and things that will be coming out of the action steps that we've provided in Taking Action that you can then hand out, print yourselves, probably some 8.5 by 11 kinds of things that you'll be able to either print from PDF or order in hard copy as well. And so we'd encourage you at this point, if you'd like Taking Action Guides, great. We would love to share them with you, but they're not for you to hand out then to any victims that you interact with. But you can walk them through the process and help them find what they need. And we're also going to be hosting a series of webinars coming up. This was just sort of kicking off this partnership and this resource. But in our upcoming webinars, and Josh will talk more about that, we will focus in more specifically on the different fraud types and really talk about the specific resources. And the first one will be an identity theft webinar coming up. So I wanted to mention that. And before I pass it back to Josh, one question that came in, and I'm not sure if I answered it to all or just to the woman who requested the question, so I'm going to put it out there. The guide is not currently available in Spanish. we are, as it's an advocate guide, we hope that an English version will suffice for now. It may be something that we do in the future, but we probably will do something like a translation with the checklist. So if that's something that you could be distributing in the community or that you could be giving to people, we'll try and make those available in multiple languages a little closer to the outset. And Josh, I'll let you finish it up. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. And yeah, that's a really good question. We're working hard to make what we have accessible in Spanish, and again, the checklists will be an accessible and easily photocopied version of the steps so that each individual can put that in their own case file that they've created and check off the steps and record information. It will be simple. Each section will be one page so that folks can easily check that off. We're working on that and developing that as a second step here with this guide. In the second week of December, the date should be settled soon, and certainly you all will receive an announcement. We'll have an identity theft recovery webinar. Mary O'Brien from the National Identity Theft Victim Assistance Network is going to be chairing that webinar and going to be talking about best practices in identity theft recovery. We wanted to provide that to the community, victim advocates, and begin talking about what best practices were out there for identity theft recovery. So you'll be hearing more about that. We encourage you to attend and encourage your colleagues to attend as well. And then in closing here, we want to look through some questions. I think that we've answered all the questions that we had placed to us. So in closing, I do want to encourage you again, you have the web address here, saveandinvest.org/fraud-center, where you can go to download a copy of the guide or to order copies of the guide, and want to encourage you to do that. And just want to say a word of appreciation to all of you for all the good work that you do. We do this so that we can help you, and certainly if you have feedback for us, you can always contact us. You can reach me. My email address is jbailes@ncvc.org. I'll put that in the chat window over on your right, and hopefully you can see that. It's sent to all participants. You can certainly feel free to contact me. And Christine, do you have anything further?
Thanks, Josh. I wanted to also mention my contact information is my name, Christine, C-H-R-I-S-T-I-N-E, and I apologize for not putting this on the slides, so it's Christine.Kieffer, K-I-E-F-F-E-R, at FINRA, F-I-N-R-A.org. And Josh just sent it out to all participants. I put it in a Q&A earlier too. So just so you have it, if you'd like to contact us or just through the Save and Invest website, you can contact me. My colleague Susan Arthur has been listening in today as well. So Susan and I are always available to work with you and take your questions, and look forward to doing so.
Thanks so much. And we have just a couple of quick questions that we'll address here. We have a question from Jacqueline Buckley, who talks about APS departments are unable to assist victims unless they willingly accept help or a doctor determines that they are not capable of taking care of themselves. For those who deny a family who might encourage them or take them to the doctor. I'm not sure what the rest of the question is. I know that from state to state, Adult Protective Services has many different approaches and policies, and I know that some of them may be a burden or difficult to get victims to work with. Again, I still really feel overall the Adult Protective Services is a helpful benefit to victims. I know that there are some barriers to that, but I still really encourage you to make that assessment and to work locally on your level to see if that assessment and that referral is worthwhile to make. And to the question concerning any comparisons to what's available in Canada, I currently don't have that information, although I would certainly be interested in learning more about that and about what is going on in Canada, since a lot of financial fraud crosses the border both north and south of the United States as well as internationally. So it's something certainly that we're going to continue to explore, as well as exploring how financial fraud affects different victim populations and how we can tailor what we're doing to meet those needs. Again, we really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us. And with that, that ends our webinar. And we hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.